It has been more than 150 years now since the great wagon trains headed west out of Missouri, hundreds deep and sometimes over a mile wide, carrying eager young immigrants to a new life in the American West. Theirs was a journey that, by today's standards, can hardly be imagined. The wonder is that anyone took to the trail at all. In the 1830s, the western half of North America was remote, dangerous, and largely unexplored. Those who made their way into this vast wasteland did so against the advice of almost everyone. To a sane person at the time, the journey was considered sheer foolishness. The distance alone was mind-boggling. Between Missouri and the Pacific Ocean, there were 2,000 miles of uncharted wilderness.
As far as the Oregon Territory, of course, at that point it was still actually owned and controlled by the British, but there was the opportunity for settlement out there. The British weren't too concerned about American influence, primarily because nobody thought that there was a possibility of Americans being able to make that kind of a trip for 2,000 miles over barren wilderness.
At the time, few people had even attempted to cross the continent. There were no roads and few trails, and no wagon had ever been driven across this great American desert. Could a wagon train even make the trip? And if so, what route was the best? Could food be gotten along the way? Could the farm equipment immigrants would need in Oregon be carried with them? And most importantly, could women and children make the journey? In 1836, a missionary named Marcus Whitman was one of the first white men to actually lead a wagon train to Oregon. In the spring of that year, he took his wife, 2 wagons, and a small party west to establish a mission in Oregon Territory. In 10 months, they reached the Columbia River, marking a trail and proving that what was once considered sheer foolishness was now a practical fact. Families could cross from Missouri to the Pacific Ocean by wagon for the cost of a few $100s. By the 1840s, word had spread throughout the East. It would be America's manifest destiny to settle the West. Free land and the promise of a better life awaited anyone willing to endure the Oregon Trail.
The fact that these people who were the immigrants went ahead and did it on their own, they in effect made the decision regardless what the United States government was going to do, profoundly changed our history and the world's history.
The people that tended to make the migration, we've been determining more and more, were not necessarily your wealthy, established families from old East Coast states. They tended to be of more moderate means, obviously very adventuresome, but seeking something more than what they were able to have in their home communities.
We think of them as pioneers. They were farmers. They were people who didn't even know how to drive a team of oxen when they started out. They were people pretty much unused to using weapons. In fact, they killed themselves a lot more than they ever killed anyone else.
But the flood of immigrants was slow to begin. In 1840, only 13 intrepid pioneers made it across to the Willamette Valley. In 1841, 58 more headed down the Oregon Trail. A year later, 125 followed. But in 1843, things began to change.
So there got to be more and more population back east. The prices of land went up, and so it was an opportunity to come west for a start if you were of somewhat humble means.
John Mark Lambertson is a historian here at the National Trail Center in Independence, Missouri. He says the immigrants had already made an arduous trek to Missouri by the time they joined other overlanders gathering here in the spring of 1843.
Because it was an expensive venture to make the trip, to be able to purchase the wagon and enough oxen to pull it and all the harness, and to be outfitted with all the foodstuffs for that many months of a trip, and of hopefully having enough money to be able to establish yourself once you got to your new location for a home.
You had to have money to go west. Most of these people were people who sold farms that they already had on the frontier and throughout the United States. They invested all of the cash from those farms in making this trip, and they had to be capable of supporting themselves for a while before they could become productive again.
William C. Bullard is an author familiar with the Great Migration.
When you got to independence, it was the last point on the frontier. Once you left here, you were out in the territories, and you were facing what they then called the Great American Desert.
The outfitters of Independence and nearby Westport had never seen such a crowd of movers as poured through their muddy streets that spring. For 20 years, commercial freight wagons had ventured down the Santa Fe Trail to trade in the West. But this year, the group was different. They were mostly families. There were close to 1,000 of them, and they were planning to go all the way to Oregon. Most of them had no idea of the dangers that awaited them along the trail. They would have to cross 3 treacherous mountain ranges, ford several wild rivers, contend with the relentless dust, and worst of all, disease. These movers were farm families who had been hit hard by the economic crash of 1837 and the deep depression that followed. It was a time when the Industrial Revolution was encroaching upon farmland. Factories were paying low wages, taxes were high, the air was filthy, and the water polluted. For many, joining a wagon train destined for Oregon offered the hope of a better life. So in the spring of 1843, the great human migration began. Today, 150 years later, modern-day movers are gathering at the National Trail Center in Independence to celebrate this great migration. They plan to retrace the historic journey their ancestors took along the Oregon Trail. For the next 6 months, Wyoming rancher Morris Carter plans to lead a wagon train to Oregon, following in many places in the very ruts left by the pioneers a century and a half ago.
Putting a train together today is not much different than 150 years ago because of the diversification of the people. We're still going to be following the same type of terrain. We're going to be under the same type of weather conditions. And the more that we think that it's changed, the more we find out it still remains the same.
It will not, however, be an easy trip. Carter and his family and a few close friends will face many of the same obstacles the first overlanders did, plus more. Today, much of the original trail has been built over as the West was civilized. Some of what is left crosses private land, Indian reservations, and federal preserves, or runs along state and federal highways. Permits will have to be obtained, water and food purchased all along the route, and arrangements made for camping each night of the 2,000-mile journey. As was true in 1843, money is also a consideration. Carter's ambitious expedition will be financed primarily by people he hopes will choose to pay money to ride along in his wagons, to experience life on the trail. But his prospects for completing the 6-month adventure seem as dim as the Missouri weather. As Carter leads his expedition out of the National Trail Center in Independence, Few onlookers here wish to brave the constant drizzle to ride in a covered wagon. Perhaps farther down the trail they will. If they don't, his dream of running the entire Oregon Trail may have to be scrubbed.
Oh God, our Father, as you sit on high and look down on us poor mortals, forgive our trespasses.
The weather was much the same in late April 1843 when thousands of the original overlanders began converging on Independence, all eager to sign on with a wagon train and get their journey underway. They knew time was of the essence. They had to make Oregon before the winter snows choked off access to the Willamette Valley. In 1843, the grass necessary to support livestock was slow in coming, and families were growing nervous as they waited inside soggy tents, hoping for the rains to end. Finally, when the grass reached 6 inches, the decision was made to start. On May 22nd, a huge caravan assembled a few miles outside Independence, and the great journey began. The departure was a wild one. As fast as anxious travelers hitched their wagons and headed off, others rushed ahead of them for the lead spots. There were quarrels, fist fights, and chaos.
And so it was a monumental task then, trying to get all of the people together, headed in the same direction at the same time, and agree upon how they were going to do that.
120 wagons left Missouri that spring, carrying nearly 1,000 immigrants west. Among them, Peter Burnett, a mover destined to become California's first governor. A family who could afford to would take 2 or 3 wagons on the trip, and most preferred to build their own to ensure that they were strong enough to make the journey.
And the people that would work on the wagon would work for passage instead of pay to go across to Oregon to follow their dream too. I think as they were signing on, they would ask them about their skills. Could they hunt? Were they a blacksmith? Had they built wagons? Were they good stock drovers, etc.? And the people would kind of sort themselves out. And it was pretty obvious to the trail captains, the people that had the ability to do the different chores.
And again, the Hollywood picture is Daddy riding on the fine white horse and Mama and the children sitting in the wagon. These wagons were about 4.5 feet wide and about 14 feet long. They were very lightly built because of the passage across the mountains. They carried a couple thousand pounds only, and what they carried had to be packed into those wagons clear up to the hooks that held the canvas across the top.
The canvas was tall enough so that a person could stand inside. Nobody slept inside the wagon, but belongings were packed on either side of a center aisle, kept clear for carrying the sick or injured. Generally, a fully loaded wagon could weigh as much as 7,000 pounds and would take a team of up to 12 horses to drag it across the plains. No wonder immigrant families started discarding their heavier belongings soon after leaving civilization.
So much of the decision-making as far as the packing, of course, had to be made back in their original home place of Illinois or Ohio or wherever they came from. And that was, a lot of that was the woman's role as far as having to decide what of all these things she had in her household that she was having to leave behind with other family members or sell. And I think a lot of that was pretty heartbreaking. They were already being uprooted from familiar environment, landscape, home, family, but to having to leave most of your personal possessions behind was an additional blow to that. So they were taking a few prized mementos and then basic necessities. There was a great deal of weaving that went into the process before being ready so that you had enough material goods along for whether it was for making coats or underwear or anything else, so that you had that clothing supply. The rest of it was largely very utilitarian things as far as foodstuffs, cooking pans, things of that nature.
Actually, oxen were cheaper than horses or mules. So a lot of them literally bought the oxen because they were cheaper, and also they could walk beside the oxen. They couldn't keep up with the horses as easily or keep up with the mules.
Almost every immigrant crossed the continent on foot. Small children and grandparents alike trudged beside their wagons at a rate of a mile an hour, making perhaps 16 miles a day on a good day.
These people were also taking with them spare oxen or mules. They were taking riding horses. They were taking cattle. A great many of them were taking hogs.
During their first days on the trail, the overlanders experienced something new all the time. They had never seen a western sunset, a prairie thunderstorm, or a real mountain, not to mention Indians. But after the first week or so, a certain routine set in and their journey became routine. Days on the trail began early. At 4 o'clock, gunshots from the sentries woke the camp. While the women had prepared breakfast, the men saddled the horses, harnessed the animals, and readied the wagons. After breakfast, the sleeping tents came down, dishes were scoured, packed, and the train was moving before sunrise. As the wagons moved west, hunters rode off to find game. Several others went ahead with picks and shovels to smooth out a path for the wagons, which seldom, if ever, stayed in a straight line as they drove west.
There was a lot of dust out on the trail, and to go in single file in that, you were really choking at the back. They tended to spread out more for air, not only with the wagons, but of course you had all these ranging cattle and horses and even sheep that would be taken along. So the wagon trains tended to be spread out much wider than what we think in terms of. That's also reflected in some of the ruts that are still visible, in that you have whole series of ruts or swales, we call them, rather than one defined path.
The livestock was in good shape and they were really traveling well. A lot of times they'd start early in the morning, noon up, take a break at noon, let them rest, graze and forage, hook them up again, and then go until late in the night. If they had a moonlit night and the trail was good and the weather was good, a lot of times they'd move on to good grass and good water.
Just before sunset, the trail captain usually traveled ahead to find a suitable campsite. At his signal, the wagons formed a circle and the travelers made camp.
They did form circles out of wagons and brought them wheel to wheel as far as making a tight circle for the wagon, but for very simple practical purposes. It was your portable fence that you could bring along by putting the wagons in a circle like that. So they did circle up wagons for evening encampments, but for that purpose of corralling livestock, not for defense against Indians. That was not necessary.
Once the wagon circle was closed and the livestock were safely inside, the children ventured out to collect wood or buffalo chips to fuel the cooking fires. The men lowered the camp stoves and pitched their tents. The hunters would have already returned and butchered the game for the evening meal, which the women would quickly set about cooking. Within an hour, dinner was served. After dinner, the children played until bedtime, which was early out on the trail. On special occasions, or to relieve the tedium of the wagon train, there was often dancing around the campfires to fiddle or harmonica music, and there was often romance. Many a young couple met and married while traversing the Oregon Trail. As it made its way through what is now northeastern Kansas and southern Nebraska, the Oregon Trail followed the gentlest slope of the land, where there was plenty of water. As a huge train of 1843 moved west, the air grew warmer and drier, the vegetation became sparse, and the lush forests of Missouri gave way to the wide open spaces of the Great Plains. About 300 miles out of Independence, the trail joined the Platte River. This, the River of Sand, was often described as 1,000 miles long and 6 inches deep. Its warm, muddy water was unpleasant to drink and often made the animals sick. But the wagons made good time along this stretch of the trail. Crossing rivers, and there were many between Missouri and Oregon, was a tedious and sometimes dangerous undertaking. It took hours for the wagon train to cross a simple, shallow ford. But crossing a deep, fast-running river could mean an eternity of unloading, caulking wagons, removing their wheels, and floating them across the treacherous currents, then reloading them on the other side before moving on.
The trail was littered with graves of all sizes. Oftentimes they were very, very shallow graves. Again, it was a matter of having to press on to get to your destination before winter snows. So oftentimes the graves were shallowly dug. The services over the dead were very, very brief to be held, and then the wagons rolled out.
The Oregon Trail has been called the world's longest graveyard. There is literally a body buried about every 80 yards out there.
Measles and smallpox were really deadly to the immigrants, and tremendous number of deaths because of that.
Although many people lost their lives to disease, most were killed because of sheer carelessness. Guns misfired in the jostling wagons. Children fell under rolling wagon wheels or were stepped on by oxen.
There are cases of the wagons pulling steep grades and stopping on the hillside, and the people trying to push them over, and then the wagon rolling backwards over them.
The mortality rate on the trail was appalling. Of the 500,000 immigrants who went west between 1842 and 1866, 1 out of every 10 died. In hindsight, few of those first overlanders would have thought themselves capable of the cooperation and discipline necessary to make it across the trail. Few had traveled for more than a week at a time before. None had ventured into such a wilderness, and certainly none had faced death on a daily basis before. Sometime during June of 1843, somewhere along the Platte, home began to seem like a dream to the travelers. The sheer magnitude of their journey, the immensity of their undertaking was now beginning to sink in. Their wagon train had been on the move for more than 2 months now, and to most of the movers, the anticipated dangers of the trip, Indian attacks, disease, death, hadn't yet materialized. Instead, something more tangible began to take over their lives: boredom. There was very little change as they traveled through this empty, vast plain. There was not a tree in sight, only shimmering haze and endless dust. The sun beat down day after day, mile after mile, until finally the wagons began rolling up the long slope toward the Rocky Mountains. By the time the immigrant train of 1843 reached the North Fork of the Platte River, the flat prairie landscape had given way to enormous clay and sandstone hills. Courthouse Rock, Chimney Rock, Castle Rock, Dome Rock, and the great saddle shape of Scott's Bluff, named for a fur trader, Hiram Scott, who died there in the 1820s under mysterious circumstances. Virtually every passing immigrant took note of these wonders. The great natural formations must have touched something deep within their hearts. They were beginning to understand that they were part of a great movement and that their lives would never be the same again. To the awestruck immigrants from the East, one of the most startling spectacles they would encounter was their first sight of a buffalo. They had no doubt read about the buffalo, but none were quite prepared for the first time they saw the awesome creature in the wild. The bulls weighed nearly a ton, but despite their formidable size, they were usually docile. They provided the wagon train with many of the essentials needed on the trail. Although buffalo meat was tough, it was plentiful. The hides made good blankets, and dried droppings known as buffalo chips were adequate fuel when wood became hard to find. However, buffalo were known to stampede. When they did, a path of destruction was left in their wake. It was an experience the immigrants would not soon forget. But these travelers didn't have much time to wonder at the buffalo. June was passing quickly now, and Oregon was still 1,300 miles away. If they were to beat the early snows, they would have to hurry on to Fort Laramie. Fort Laramie was the last way station before the Oregon Trail headed up into the Rockies, and it was the point of no return for any immigrant who may now be thinking of heading back home.
Sometimes that did occur, especially in the case of maybe the head of a household dying along the way, and the decision being made, we can't go on without this individual, and that they would turn around and go back. So most of the migration, most of the traffic was all one way. It was going from east to west.
Fort Laramie was so busy during the peak of the migration that during one day alone in 1850, 6,034 people passed by its gates. As they moved west, the immigrant wagons left the Platte Valley, which they had followed for nearly 500 miles now, and joined the Sweetwater River as it wound its way toward the Continental Divide. As they ascended the mountains, the immigrants skirted the most famous point on the trail, Independence Rock. If you were to make Oregon before the snows fell, experts warned you would have to reach Independence Rock by July 4th. In spite of the urgency, many took the time to mark their names and the date they passed by on the rocks beside the trail. The wagons then drove on toward South Pass. By now, the movers were about halfway on their journey, and July was slipping away. As the wagon train crested the Rockies, many never realized that they were standing on the top of the American continent. Early scouts had picked South Pass to cross the backbone of America for its gradual, even ascent to the 7,550-foot summit of the mountains. If it had not been for the easy grades here, chances are it would never have been possible to get wagons across the Rockies. A few miles west, at a spot called Parting of the Ways, the immigrants were forced to make a decision. In one direction, they could head on a direct route to Oregon via the Sublette Cutoff. In another, they could veer to the left and drop down toward Fort Bridger, 100 miles away. Those who were headed for California veered to the left here. But the movers going to Oregon in 1843 decided against the shorter but more dangerous Sublette Cutoff. Instead, they went down past Fort Bridger with the others and split off towards the amazing hot springs at Bear Valley before passing through the sheer-walled gorge of the Snake River. It is now well into August. And Morris Carter's wagon expedition to Oregon is still together, nearing Pocatello, Idaho. His wagons have spent the last few days crossing the large Bannock Indian Reservation of eastern Idaho and are now pressing on toward the fairgrounds in Pocatello, where they plan to camp for the night. Disease and accident have taken only a minimal toll on Carter's wagon train, but the lack of guests willing to pay to ride along and government regulations have more than once threatened to end it. But like those who passed here a century and a half ago, Carter presses on in spite of the obstacles.
Well, what excites me is being able to take the wagons over the old trail and seeing new country and experiencing what you have read about before and people have talked about. So traveling over the terrain, getting the wagons over physically, watching them go, and then learning the history of the trails. We've had so many people that their ancestry goes back the trail that's came out and talked to us about the trail. And that's always exciting, is to hear someone that their forefathers came on the trail and then settled their place, and they invite us on, and that's really exciting. To actually feels like you're touching in a part of history.
We crossed the big muddy, the ferry was full of women and children and men. We turned toward the west and a new life out there. We'd not see Missouri again. Then the days turned to weeks in the mud and the rain. The oxen grew tired of the grind. Stories of Indians, death and disease constantly worked on my mind. Then I met young Kathy McLean in the fall. They toasted with fine Irish ale. Then his Ben played his fiddle and Will played his harp. We danced on the Oregon Trail. We danced at the end of the trail. The daily ritual has changed little on the trail during the last century and a half. Once the wagons arrive at camp for the night, they are circled, tents are pitched, and the animals set out to feed.
Okay, guys, get ready for the picture.
The McTammany family from New Egypt, New Jersey, has made the trip from Fort Hall, 10 miles away, and the experience has definitely left an impression.
It was bumpy and bumpy.
It's basically what I imagined it would be.
Even though it was a little bumpy, that really didn't bother me at all.
You know, until you've sat there and been through all the bumps and stuff and realizing it took them 7 months, you just really don't know what they went through to settle our country and how much the gratitude we owe them for what they went through.
Being a National Historic District.
Laurel Cookman is retracing much of the trail and has discovered that the men then and now don't necessarily do all the hard work.
I think the women did a lot of hard work. They did the laundry, they did the cooking, they took care of the children, and they had very, very long days. Plus, they had to walk, where the men got to ride horses, got to ride on the wagon. Sure, they took care of the wagons and they took care of the animals and the harnesses, and that isn't easy either, but if I were to go back 150 years from now, I think I would choose the man's job over the women's job.
Yeah, here, talk to the guy.
Even today, the Oregon Trail leaves an indelible impression on everyone who has touched it.
Then as now, it takes a toll on you covering a lot of the miles of the trail. And we've been about 1,300 miles and have another 900 to go. And I think it's been a great experience to correlate between now and then, and it takes the same toll on the people. It's been a very touching, moving experience for us and for them.
Ben Kern has been with the Carter expedition since it left Independence more than 3 months ago. For over 1,000 miles now, he has guided his mules, Amos and Andy, in the very footsteps of the immigrants of 1843. Copying their routine day after day, he is up before the sun, performing the same tasks that they did, tasks that vary little day after day.
They kind of like to be brushed a little bit anyway. Makes their temperament a little better.
To him, life on the trail is never boring.
It's quite a chore to harness horses in every morning, but to me it's enjoyable. I like to harness horses and make sure your harness fits real good, and always make sure your collars fit real good. That's real important. Keep your horses in good shape. Well, I'll go get my harness. Yeah, that was one of the things that I think people really took pride in, is have good harness and good. If they didn't have, why their operation didn't work very good. They had to have a good harness and keep in good shape, and that's really, really important, how your horses work. Keep it good and straight, kind of just folds itself out. This is your hame strap. This buckles your hames around your collar. That needs to be real tight. That's real important. That's one of the things that holds everything together. This is belly on your harness. Buckle it up, keeps your harness in place. We have crupper on this harness that helps keep it in place. I guess that's pretty much the size of it. Andy. This is this is your guidelines to keep your horses going in the right direction. I know it's hard to keep up with this. Oh, Andy. What? He's just taking your picture. Yeah. When you get scared, I'm going to go to the back, hook up my tugs. Andy, step in here. Okay, I'm hooked up. I'm going to get aboard.
set the film. Yeah, we'll just take it.
You ready? We're gonna go. Amos, Andy.
There may be concrete interstates running where virgin prairie once stood. Today's wagon train may move across paved roads and fenced land and be subject to government regulations never dreamt of a century and a half ago. But aside from that, life out here on the Oregon Trail is much the same now as it was for the first overlanders. You can imagine how the wild Mustangs must have felt when they saw their first wagon train roll by. What a strange sight it must have been. Think of what the Indians must have felt when Marcus Whitman first led his wagons west in 1836. Is the reaction any different today? And so, as August passes on the Oregon Trail, Morris Carter's expedition moves along the banks of the Snake River toward the Blue Mountains of Oregon.
When I travel the trail, I visualize what it would have been like 150 years ago and also what's going on at the present time. The bridges have made it easier for crossing, but I'm excited about the trail ahead. There's a lot of history and a lot of rugged trail ahead that'll be fun to put the wagons on.
High on Flagstaff Hill, overlooking the trail as it passes Baker City in eastern Oregon, the Bureau of Land Management has built an impressive monument to those who were part of America's Great Migration. Inside the Oregon Trail Center, life-size replicas of the wagons, livestock, and people who made the historic crossing tell their own story. In exact detail, visitors can see what this great adventure must have been like.
Well, you always dream of something better, not for yourselves, but for your young ones and their young ones coming on. And that's why I myself traveled out here, trying to look for something new, something better. Family life along the Oregon Trail, everyone had something to do. They all had their responsibilities, from the oldest to the youngest. Of course, the oldest were mostly in charge of the babies, taking care of the young one. But there were some that just sat and thought about it, and the women thinking about it and saying they needed to go back. They couldn't stand it out here no more.
Interpretive specialists like Nancy Harms Worthington bring the world of those first immigrants to life for a new generation.
But for me, the trip is something not only that I have to sometimes wonder, maybe I don't know exactly why I went, the calling. But I always felt it was for my future, my children's future. And the settling, the choices, the trip, I can't say I regret it all.
The Oregon Trail Center is one of the latest of many monuments that line the historic route to Oregon. Many date back to the turn of the century and were built by a remarkable-looking man who first came across the trail himself in 1852. Ezra Meeker was a tireless pioneer who had settled in Oregon at the age of 22. In 1906, when he was 76, Meeker, his dog Joe, and 2 oxen pulled a wagon back east along the trail, backtracking all the way to Missouri. Meeker was a true promoter dedicated to preserving the trail and its history. He published a series of postcards featuring landmarks along the route. He raised money to erect stone markers along the way, and he was never shy about getting in front of a camera, as here, while he demonstrated the correct way to float a wagon across a river. The markers he erected on that journey still stand today, a testament to the trail and the people who used it. September was passing quickly now as the wagon train of 1843 moved beyond Baker City. When it reached the Blue Mountains, foliage was so thick it took 40 axemen to chop a path for the wagons. The land was lush. Their destination was within sight, and the travelers were getting anxious to end their journey. By the late fall, the wagon train was beginning to break apart. Some immigrants had bid farewell to the others and stayed to settle the towns of southern Idaho and eastern Oregon. But to those who ventured on, the weather turned cold and the rain seldom let up. But at least the snows had not yet come. Once the train reached the Hudson Bay trading post at the head of the Walla Walla River, most of the wagons had dispersed. Families whose animals still had the strength forced their way along the wooded paths beside the Columbia River. Many were sick, food was scarce, and the constant rains turned the trail into a river of mud. After coming this far, many immigrants wondered if they would ever make it to civilization in the Willamette Valley. For Morris Carter's wagon train, the journey into Oregon is a bit easier as the historic expedition rolls into Independence, Oregon, more than 2,000 miles and 6 months from Missouri, where they had started so long ago. This is a modest ending to such a monumental accomplishment, as Carter delivers a ceremonial pouch of mail that was entrusted to him at the start of his journey. A symbol of just how far we have come since that first migration across the great American desert.
Well, it's been an incredible journey and an awesome experience. And as we've traveled across the trails and had vicious storms, surrounded by tornadoes, you can look right into what they went through because we were going through it.
And in other instances, it makes you very sad because of the lack of wildlife roaming the trail today. We see antelope and we see wild horses and we see prairie dogs, but you don't see buffalo unless they're being commercially raised. And I think it's been very sad for me not to see buffalo roaming just wild and free.
I'm glad that we accomplished the trip, made it here, but I've got mixed emotions about it being over with. I kind of feel sad that it is over with.
Today is a day of emotions. You're high, you're low, you're glad, you're sad. So we went through the whole gamut.
Some of the families who started across the trail in 1843 did give up, turn around, and go back. But many more did not. Most made it safely to their destinations and started new lives in America's northwest frontier. They never regretted the gamble they had taken, and to many, the trip turned out to be the greatest adventure of their lives. When the wagon train of 1843 finally arrived in the West, the American population of Oregon country was doubled. Within 3 years, more than 5,000 made the trip across the Oregon Trail. Many, many more would follow. By sheer force of numbers, the immigrant army forced the British to give up their claim to Oregon without a single shot being fired. America's manifest destiny had become a reality.
It was a momentous event for all these people that made that trip something that they never ever forgot, and I think always looked back upon as being one of the great adventures of their lives.
I think what we did out of all of this was not only to secure the economic power and the material results of the migration, but as a side product, I really think we came closer to creating the American character than anything has ever done before.
Americans owe those early pioneers a great debt of gratitude, for their migration west truly welded the nation. Their courage and determination became a testament to the spirit of the American people. The story of the Oregon Trail is a tradition that sets Americans apart from any other people on earth. I'm Red Steagal. I hope you've enjoyed this look at an American tradition. We crossed the big muddy, the ferry was full of women and children and men. We turned toward the west and a new life out there. We'd not see Missouri again. Then the days turned to weeks in the mud and the rain. The oxen grew tired of the grind. Stories of Indians, death and disease constantly worked on my mind. Fort Hall on the Snake was a wonderful sight. We cheered as we hurried on in. The Cheyenne had trailed us the last several days. We were glad to find shelter and friends. We reached Fort Vancouver the 7th of May. We'd traveled for most of a year. The Columbia Valley became our new home. If only my papa was here. Then I married young Kathy McWayne in the fall. They toasted with fine Irish ale. Then as Ben played his fiddle and Will played his harp, we danced at the end of the trail.